Everyone for being here. This is very exciting. Yeah, I do work from home, so I don't get to see many people. Please feel free to turn your cameras on if you'd like to, but I totally understand if you don't, so that's no problem. Today we're going to talk about connecting with media and creating effective stories. So what I'm hoping to cover today in the agenda, we are going to have, let's see, we're going to do a quick introduction of myself. We'll talk a bit about the basics of storytelling, how to get noticed by the media and you, how to sort of tell your own story if you don't find that you're getting a lot of uptake from media outlets. I mean, there's always social media, and we'll talk a bit about how that is such a huge way to get noticed, but it's also such a great way for your organizations to be telling their own stories. A bit of a peek behind the curtain. So I'll tell you a bit about how the media works, and so sort of best timing, what you can expect, stuff like that. If you'd like, if anyone's open to it, I'm happy to brainstorm ideas as to how you can sort of take what you're doing and turn it into a better story for the media to pick it up. And then, of course, we'll do some questions at the end. So this will be about 45 minutes. And then, yeah, if you've got any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a senior producer at Jar Audio. So basically, for about the last 2 years, about 2 years ago, I became a podcast producer. So I work in the branded podcast production. So I don't know how many of you are big podcast listeners. I know some people love it. Others don't even know exactly what it is. But I moved over from being a reporter about 2 years ago, and it's been a pretty interesting move. What I do right now is I work for a company, and we make podcasts for, say, a company, an environmental group, really whoever's got the funding in order to make their own podcast, so that they're able to tell their own stories, or at the very least talk about what it is that's important to them. So a tech company will talk about the latest tech. A headhunting company could talk about leadership. I'm doing one for a communications company, and they talk about things like how to deliver bad news, the downside of grammar gatekeeping, or even just like the basics of storytelling is one I'm working on right now. It's very interesting, but I do have to say I miss working locally, because I live in New Brunswick. I'm in Sackville. And what I used to do, sorry, I'm kind of getting ahead of the slides. We can just go straight to slide 5 there. I used to be a reporter at CBC Moncton. So I did that for about 10 years. I loved that job. It was really fun. I got to meet a lot of people. I don't see any names that are familiar to me at the moment on the list here, but I did get to work with a lot of environmental groups. And that's the fun thing about being a local reporter, is you get to do a little bit of just about everything, and you really get to develop what it is you like to do. I like going out in the fields. So that's why I formed relationships with some different environmental groups in the province. And it was to tell really important stories, but it was also because I like going outside. I love getting a phone call and having a setup where it's like, we're going to be doing this all day. Do you want to come out on the boat with us? And that was a dream come true. I do miss that quite a bit. And a lot of the information I'm going to be giving you today it's very CBC specific, because that's where I worked and that's what I can tell you the most about. But that said, a lot of places do work very similarly. And especially in New Brunswick, the CBC has the best resources as far as how many people are working in the province, CBC and Radio-Canada, obviously. But and as a reporter, when I first started, it was sort of a joke where it was like a story a day keeps the pink slip away. Like, we really did have to produce. Every day you were expected to come in with a really good idea. And that's why the easier you make it for journalists to sort of pick up on your story, the more they're going to do it. So I did a talk very similar to this about 2 years ago. And I went through all my slides, and then I asked if there's any questions. And at the very end, I think the first question I was asked was like, why would I want to do this? Like, why do I want my story in the media? And I was like, oh, maybe that's where I should have started. So I'm kind of switching it up a bit. I've got some ideas of why I think it's important. I think it's important to talk about what you're doing. You get community buy-in. All the work you're doing, we all get so ingrained in how it works, we forget that other people don't know. And I think it's really important to be sharing the stories with the public. But then there's also things like, I would assume it's probably, it's always good to stick it on your website. But I wanted to ask, and I don't know if anybody's in a position to be answering any questions right now, but if you are, I'm curious, is anybody on the call, have you worked with the media before? Like, have you been involved in stories? I guess I'm always curious to see how.
Oh yeah, I'm not shy. Yes, we've had some media uptake.
How's it been? Was it a general positive experience? Like, what was your takeaway after?
Most of it was generally positive. So we've had a couple of different iterations where, either we've gone out to the media and said, here's our story, we want to talk about it. We've also had media come to us knowing that we want to talk about a couple of different topics. So generally it's been pretty good. I think it's something that's a little bit unnerving for a lot of us small NGOs. And there's a couple of different ways that we can be interacting with media, and the live stuff is a little bit scarier than
it is for everybody
offline. And then also even the reflection of your organization back in the media you read. I've had some where the print star is like, that's not really what I meant. Obviously I didn't get my point across in a way that as clear as I thought I had. So it's been a bit of a mixed bag for us.
Okay, no, that's interesting. I kind of later on, I'll get into a little bit, just sort of some tips and tricks, even that we as reporters, because it's nerve-wracking for everyone if you're not used to it, which most of us aren't. If you host your own show and do it live every day, you don't get nervous anymore, but otherwise it is nerve-wracking. Lily, did you have something you'd like to say?
Yeah, and sorry for not having my camera on right now. Just a lot of Wi-Fi use in my apartment right now. But yeah, actually quite recently with my work with the NBN, we did quite a bit of media outreach around a public survey study that we did, opinion survey, and got some coverage and online print anyways. I'm not sure if it went in actual print. CBC and Acadie Nouvelle and Radio Canada, and as well as some other radio stations with Acadia Broadcasting. And yeah, I would say overall like a positive experience, and I kind of found like once we got some interest, it definitely was a bit of a domino effect. Like there was a lot more interest once we got one story out there. And but I would say too, like it's similar to what Melanie shared, is that I have found as well, like sometimes, you read what was made it into the article and you're like, oh, like that's not really the full story of what I was trying to say. Or like I had one of them, I did a full like 20-minute Zoom interview and got the article back, and it was my press release that I'd read. Like it had nothing from the interview, and so that was a little frustrating. But yeah, overall like quite positive. And then like after that too, we recently had another reporter at CBC, but like on television, reach out to us about like helping facilitate a series of like I guess just like a series of interviews and features of different climate adaptation projects throughout the province. So it was definitely like as a network, especially like part of what we obviously want to do is help like facilitate connections, and so it's neat to then like have made built some more relationships so that we can not only like get coverage ourselves, but also like help our member organizations get coverage too.
Absolutely. Especially if you found that the people who you really kind of connected with, or you did find, do a really good job. And thank you very much for speaking up. Yeah, save those phone numbers and give them a call. And reporters always like to feel like they're first. So if you've got somebody who you think did a particularly good job or you really enjoyed speaking with, feel free to give them a call when you've got the next thing coming on, or give them an email. They don't even necessarily have to be first, but keep them in mind. I'm sorry to hear, to do those long interviews and then not have it used. I have a feeling whoever did the interview was probably also very frustrated. That's the thing about in day to day, there's just such conflicting within. Let's say the premier comes out with whatever is the next thing he's going to do. He does it on a certain day and all the plans fall apart. And whoever was supposed to take that interview and write it up got stuck onto something else that was like breaking news. It can be a pretty frustrating thing because reporters often want you to call back right away, but then depending on where their focus is, that's what they're off doing that day, and it might not be yours. So it feels like a big hurry until all of a sudden they drop it and it's not. But unfortunately, that's just how it works. It's not very polite, but that is how it goes sometimes. But we'll talk a bit about sort of how to try to get your message across. I mean, sometimes it's just not what you want them to say, is just not what the focus of their story is. But sometimes, yeah, there's ways to kind of work it in a bit, and we can talk a bit about that. Yes. Okay. So I guess that kind of covers. I'm glad to see everybody does find it to be quite important. And yeah, so on the next slide, it's a bit here's a big fact for you. So basically any kind of story, if a fact is wrapped in a story, it's 22 times more likely, it's more memorable than a mere pronouncement of fact. So that's according to Jerome Bruner, who's a cognitive psychologist. And I do know, I don't know if it's a pandemic or age or what it is, but I have a hard time remembering things, but I do find story, you read a book and you can, all these webs that are with the plot line is so easy to remember. So it just makes it more fun as well. So not only is the media more likely to pick up on it, but it's also just, you can have so much more impact if it's a great story. So what makes the story good? Well, what makes the story good is someone doing something for a reason. That's like 101 journalism school stuff, is there just has to be some kind of action. So I know that I did have a number of times where I'd get press releases where it's like, we're having our annual barbecue. And that's fine. You can send those press releases out. And the story could be, this group is having a barbecue to celebrate their anniversary, but that's not a good story. It takes a little more thought. Now, if all you really want people to know about is that barbecue, there's still other ways to weave it. The barbecue is probably not the best example because you wouldn't necessarily, I don't think that's anybody's big focus, but if you bring in things like, think of characters. So pick someone from your organization who is best in a position to talk about this. If somebody hates doing media, you can practice. You can do a lot of things to get yourself more comfortable with it, or you can let someone who really enjoys doing it, do it. Every organization, obviously, that's the call to make within the group. But there usually is somebody who sort of really likes doing that. And some people are just naturals. They can just come out with these like one-line zingers that makes it so easy to write a story because they just can frame things in such a catchy, snappy way. But also, I mean, you can think of characters as in for example, your group is putting in a fish ladder. But the fish ladder, you want to talk about the fish ladder, but it's on somebody's private property. You can ask them beforehand to see if they'd be interested in participating in media with you, so that you've got someone who is like, yeah, it's my land, but I decided to let them come onto it and put in a fish ladder because there used to be so many more fish and I don't see them anymore, or I really support this, or whatever it is their reason. They're like, oh, I've never heard of a fish ladder, so I thought it'd be hilarious. So I let them on, I let them do it, whatever the reason is. But that brings in a bit of that human interest, and it makes it more of a personal story because people can sort of relate better to what this person is living as opposed to a member of your group telling their story. So when the both of them are in a story, you've got kind of everything you could possibly want. So if you already can see who that person might be, or that secondary voice might come in handy, check with them beforehand, keep their phone number on hand. So when you do get a call from the media, you can throw out a good suggestion, or you can put it in the press release. Other things, just think about plot, think about tension. Something needs to be at stake in order for people to really care about the story. And tension doesn't necessarily have to be, doesn't have to be bad. So what makes something newsworthy? You've got timeliness. If it's something that's happening now is news. A big part of proximity. So like in New Brunswick, for example, they cover New Brunswick news. Now, there are 3 stations for CBC. Radio Canada has a few more up north, but in New Brunswick, for Anglophones, it's Moncton, St. John, Fredericton. There used to be somebody in Bathurst. There isn't anymore. So they'll send somebody up north sometimes to cover things. Unfortunately, the further you are away from one of these offices, sometimes the harder it can be. And that's, I think, why forming relationships with reporters is really important, because there are people who like to cover stories like myself. There's people even more so. There's a guy named Shane Fowler who works for CBC. He has a drone. He loves to take his drone out into the middle of the woods and do a story. So if you call him up and you give him a good idea of what something you're doing, he can get some shots of you physically doing something, building something, installing something, even just cleaning garbage. Like if there's an action that he can go get shots of with his drone and it's far away from the office in Fredericton, he could very well be interested. So that's where these relationships come into play, because news outlets cover local, but it's like anything. There's so many hours in the day. It can, the further you're driving, the harder it gets. So that's something to keep in mind, especially if you know it's far, but you can set it up and you've got some time to sort of see what kind of interest there is to draw people out. You still might get it covered, because although TV is kind of a dying sport in the news industry, there's video. I mean, video is king. So if you've got something that looks particularly flashy well, as the list, you've got a novelty, a rarity, anything like that. I mean, people are interested. A moose jumps in a swimming pool. That's, I don't know how many views something like that gets, like millions. It's crazy. And because you're doing such interesting work, definitely, if you've got some kind of video, at the end of the day, you think to yourself like, oh, I have to show so-and-so, put it on your social media, because you never know what's going to get picked up. And people obviously spend a lot of time just scrolling, watching these videos. So if you've got something, put it out there and see what happens. It's definitely worth a go. Newsworthy, you need to have something that's got some impact, some consequence. There's the novelty, rarity, conflict. That doesn't have to be personal conflict. I think I was looking at a press release at the Shediac Bay Watershed Association, and they've got like a dog poo initiative where they're trying to get people to pick up their dog poo. There's conflict. I mean, it's very easy to find someone who hates having to walk through dog poo. That's an easy one. It's conflict. It's something everybody can relate to. There must be, with the groups, with what you're working on now, I mean, it's just, environmental disaster kind of everywhere. So I know stories have to be framed in a particular way, very specifically as to what you're doing. But there does seem to be, I think it'd be pretty easy with a lot of stories to come up with some conflict, just some natural conflict that's built into the story. Human interest, like I say, someone who cares, because we all do. It's pretty easy when you've got that person. It's good to have somebody from the group who can talk about what you're doing. But then it's also, if you know who that perfect person is, who's really upset with something or who really cares, or, it's just like has got a neat story that has something to do with it, write it into the press release or mention it to the reporter when you're talking. Another thing that makes something very newsworthy, celebrity, any kind of celebrity, unfortunately, it absolutely draws people in. So not unfortunately, but use it to the best of your advantage. If you want a news story and you've got any kind of hook, definitely do that. I was doing some Googling, and even the novelty and the rarity one, a sea lamprey. There are so many CBC New Brunswick stories with a picture of a sea lamprey with its like teeth kind of like stuck to the, anyway, like, I don't think they're unusual, but the photo is so good. I think reporters can't help but keep coming back to sea lamprey stories. So keep that in mind. If you've got a photo of something kind of disgusting, or, use that to then go and talk about the work that you're doing. One way to really talk about impact consequence is to have some hard data. So That's, I'm sure, a big part of the work that you're doing is to have these numbers on hand. I know that I ran into the problem of sometimes when I'd go out in the field with someone, they wouldn't have the latest numbers available because that's what they're in the process of collecting. So, but even just sort of try to get creative, whether it's last year's numbers to prove that this is what you think you're going to be doing. Any kind of numbers really prove that it's a real story, and reporters can really, they really bite into that. And I'm sure you've got, I would imagine that's a large part of what you're doing. So let's say you've kind of got, you've got this material, you've come up with a story, you have some sense of like what you want the hook to be of how you're going to put your information out. We've got a press release, and in a sec, I'll kind of go over just the do's and don'ts. It's pretty basic stuff. Social media. If there's a reporter not assigned to a story, chances are good they're sitting at their desk scrolling through social media. So if you put stuff out there, like that's what they're looking at. It used to be that we would say news doesn't happen in the office and you were supposed to get out and just go, like they'd rather you drove around all day than sit there not doing anything. Over the years, that's changed. And now it's just scrolling social media, looking for a story to happen or just something to grab the eye. Lots of reporters don't do that, but that's sort of like, if you're having a bad day, that's what you end up doing, is sitting there looking. So use your social media to the best of your ability. Follow reporters, try to find them where you can. It's becoming more complicated because Twitter, I think, Twitter is definitely where journalists go, but then that's kind of shifting because it's getting worse and worse. But Facebook doesn't seem like it's used as much, but I know reporters still cruise Facebook. So I would definitely go through there. And there's also, of course, Instagram, but whatever ones you use, just try to find reporters and news agencies, follow them. You'll probably get a follow back and post your stuff there. Yeah. And there's even new rules coming in with the whole news thing, but we'll see how that lands. Phone calls can be good, especially if it's something that's happening quickly. If all of a sudden you're like, oh, this is good. Maybe somebody's interested. That's where it's a good idea to keep those contacts. So you can just call a reporter and be like, hey, would you be interested in this? And just run it by them quickly. A press release is a great thing, but if you've got relationships with reporters and you can just call them and run it by them, it's very mutually beneficial to everyone. So keep those contacts handy and feel free to pick up the phone. Okay, so the art of a good press release. So keep the subject line punchy with keywords. An example I have of this is the Nature Conservancy. They came out with a program. It was called the Moose Sex Corridor. And it was just such an obvious grab for attention, and it totally worked because who can resist the Moose Sex Corridor? It was basically just they conserved some land between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, like the Chignecto Isthmus, so that moose could go back and forth between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. But I mean, I'm sure that was just some people sitting around having a laugh, came up with the title, and it was very successful because if you Google that, there are so many stories written about the Moose Sex Corridor because that is a hard thing to sort of make sound super punchy and exciting, but I don't know, if you come up with stuff like that, it does make something kind of funny, and it goes a long way. It also makes the job easier for the reporter because they don't have to come up with something punchy. You've delivered it to them. Yeah, and other keywords, I mean, endangered, at risk, disappearing, fighting to save, I think I know not everybody on this call is a scientist. I know it's maybe sometimes you don't want to go overboard and make something too sensational, but if it actually fits what's happening, absolutely use the word to sort of be like, break it down of like, this is what's happening. And then in the press release, you get into the 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, and why. I don't think anybody does this anymore except for my kid's school, but don't send your main message as an attachment. It's just super annoying and probably won't get read. A thing to keep in mind is that news outlets get so many emails, they often have an automatic reply that says, we won't necessarily respond to you. By no means does that mean they are not reading your emails. Definitely still send them. I know that the morning shows in New Brunswick, the radio morning shows, if you send them an email, you get an automatic reply back that makes you feel like they're telling you, I'm not reading this. They absolutely are. They're just telling you, we might not respond to you, but it is their job to stay on top of those emails. So I'll give you the emails at the end of the talk if you don't have them already. But they read them all. And you've got these morning shows they desperately need content every single day. So they're really searching for things of interest. So it's absolutely worth your time to send out what you're doing. Make sure in this press release that you've got a link to your website and any other important information. And then make sure that you include contact information of someone who will return their call or email. Because as we've got on the next slide here, it is so important to call back as soon as possible. If somebody calls you, if you wait a few days, the opportunity could have passed. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, sometimes it does work that it's their emergency makes it your emergency, and then they can lose interest and have to go do something else. Unfortunately, that's just the way it works sometimes, but not usually. Usually, if you're getting a call from a reporter, they want to set something up with you in the near future. So, you don't have to call them back on a Sunday night, but when you get the message on a Monday morning, give them a shout, because I know that in my time as a journalist, I would call the people who I knew were going to answer the phone. Like if I had a list of watershed associations and I just needed a clip from one, if I had a relationship with somebody and I knew that they were really quick to call me back, it's probably who I'd go to if I was on a tight deadline, because deadlines, it's how the day works when you're a journalist. Like it used to be every day at 5 o'clock was your deadline. It's a little bit different now, but it still is. You've got these really hard and fast deadlines and you have to hit them. That is sort of what your whole career is based on, is hitting these deadlines. So if you can rely on someone to call you back, it makes all the difference in the world. Yeah, the next slide is there's a picture of what a deadline looks like. All right, so talking to the media. So this is a bit, Melanie, I hope this kind of covers, I know it's super nerve-wracking. It helps if you build relationships, because then you're more comfortable speaking to the person. Everybody has every reporter kind of has their own way of operating. I always felt that the more relaxed I was, the more relaxed my interview subject was, the better the interview is going to be. I hope nobody on this call has really had to deal with a difficult interview. Usually what you're talking about is it's a friendly topic. It's a topic that everybody is sort of happy to be discussing. You don't have a reporter who's trying to get information out of you that you don't want. That's usually more for sort of elected officials, people it's a different relationship. So the more comfortable you can be, the better. There's always the joke, I think they do it on TV, where police officers are always talking about, the individual was driving a motor vehicle. Try to really relax, which is hard to do, but just try to be yourself and use plain language. So if you're talking about a fairly complicated subject, it is always a good idea to really put a lot of thought beforehand of how you're going to explain it. I mean, sometimes some of you might be in communications and you've had to say these things a million times, but it's really important that the reporter understands what you're saying, because then they have to go tell somebody else the story. So, as Lily and Melanie, you were saying earlier, sort of maybe you weren't clear enough. Maybe the reporter wasn't paying enough attention. Maybe they had a different focus. Maybe you weren't clear enough. Who knows? But practicing and having your talking points really does make a difference. And yeah, some of these topics are really complicated, and not every reporter has a science brain by any means, or is familiar with what you're talking about. So hopefully they keep asking the questions until they totally understand. But being able to explain it clearly in simple terms goes a long way. Yeah, think about what you want to say and practice, especially if you're going to do something live. Those are usually very friendly interviews. You're going to talk to a morning show host, or you're going to talk to maybe Vanessa Vanderva in the afternoon. There's probably other radio stations in the area that I've never listened to, but practice. I ran through this talk a couple times before I sat down to do it, because I know if I don't catch myself, I'll just start babbling too much, and it helps me bring it back and focus it down. I always tell my kids, even with job interviews, but this is sort of like a job interview to the max. If you're doing a live interview, just really practice a bit, and it makes you a lot more comfortable, unless you're natural, which some people absolutely are. Definitely don't shy away from the whole story. Like if there's more at play, but it's not something you're super keen to talk about, you should have a big think and a talk with maybe other people at your organization beforehand to sort of talk about how you want to deal with that. Because if a reporter is coming to you to talk about a particular thing, it's always best, you can't sugarcoat things. You've got to be honest. So I would definitely there should be some strategy there if you've got some stuff you don't want to talk about, especially if you're not kind of media trained. Otherwise, it's just best to sort of be open, be honest about everything. And if it's something you don't want to talk about, don't do the interview, I guess would be my and as a journalist, I don't say that lightly, because I'm always like, oh, just talk about it. It's always best to talk about it. But having a clear message and really practicing beforehand are the most important things when it comes to that. The next slide here, rules of engagement. So off the record is an actual thing where you and the reporter are supposed to agree beforehand that whatever's going to be said is off the record. If you both do that, you're in great shape. If you find yourself saying something that you didn't mean to say and you're like, oh, that was off the record, it's not really how it works. Then you'd need to stop and have a conversation about how that just went. I don't know how often you talk about off the record stuff. If you ever do find that you've got some really juicy information or stuff that you as an organization aren't comfortable talking about, but you think it would be of interest to a reporter, definitely, print it off, stick it in a brown envelope and drop it off somewhere. People do it, and we get some fantastic stories that way. So I don't know if you're ever if you've got something and you can't personally be the face of it, that's a great way to go. Or you can talk to someone off the record just to get a sense of what they know or what they don't know with a reporter if you're trying to hand something off. If somebody calls you and wants to talk on background, they're just looking for information. They aren't going to be quoting you in the story. They're not taking clips from you. They just want to know more information and they're investigating. They're kind of digging in a bit. Otherwise, you just need to assume that everything is on record. I don't know how many kind of covert or difficult conversations you're having, but that is just something to keep in mind, that really, if you're talking to a reporter and you're saying stuff, it's on record. If it's a recorded conversation and you're sort of headed off in the wrong direction, even if it is just sort of, you feel like yourself just like talking in circles, you're not saying what you want, just stop what you're saying. Say I'm going to try that one again, and then just try it again. That's absolutely fine. It's not like it's not live. So take another stab at it. If you do feel like you're kind of going in circles at all, or just not saying what you want, take a break, take another stab at it. That's fine. If it's live, that would sound a lot harder, but if it's live, hopefully you practice and just take a deep breath and just keep going. If you say something that you don't mean to say, or you're like, oh, I said that number wrong, correct yourself. That's absolutely fine. Everybody makes mistakes sometimes. But if you read the story, you hear the story, you come across whatever it is you've participated in after the fact, and you find something that's just flat out wrong, definitely contact the reporter, the producer, whoever it is you were working with. Contact them right away and let them know. I know on the CBC website, on Radio Canada website, there's a place you can fill out a form if you found a mistake, and definitely do that, because reporters don't want to get it wrong. They want to get it right. So if you tell them, they'll get it fixed up right away. If you found that, if you find that it's sort of is not the focus you wanted, sort of what you were talking about earlier, not the focus you wanted, it wasn't the message you thought you were conveying, and it's just sort of off a bit. If you want to, it's definitely worth a conversation. There's nothing wrong with giving the person a call and talking it through. Everybody's different, so you probably have a better sense of how that conversation might go. But I think most reporters, it's an important job. With great power comes great responsibility. So if you find that you're not happy with it, you have every right to say something, and you definitely should, because media needs to be held accountable as everybody else does. So if you find it was an egregious mistake, you can go to the CBC has an ombudsman you can go make a complaint to. hopefully it would never come to that, but that's absolutely on the board. But if it's a small mistake, nothing hurt my feelings more than when I would sort of do a story with someone, a story that I thought was really good. We'd spent the day sort of doing whatever it was we were doing. And then afterwards they'd complain online about my story that something was wrong. I was like, oh, if you'd told me, I would have fixed it. So I like go to the reporter and fix it up. No problem. I can't imagine anyone would not be interested in having it be right. Let's see. Okay, making your own stories through social media. I was talking a bit about the videos there. I mean, you're probably like everybody else where you've got so much to do. I don't know. I know there's a variety, the groups here are different variety of sizes. Some people love social media. If you love it and you're good at it, definitely put it out there as often as you can. That's how you get picked up in the media. That's how you can get so much attention that way. But not everybody's into it. So I think you kind of have to stay within your own, comfort zone on that one. But if you are making your own stories, I mean, like, all the stuff like with characters, get some people who actually care about this, get some people, even if you have a volunteer who is there for some really great reason. You've got a volunteer who's 105 years old. You've got any of these kind of things, like any kind of hook that you're just like, oh, that's really interesting. Make a little video about it. Stick it on your social media page. The things get picked up in such a huge way when it's put out on your own. That's a way to get interest, but it's also like, now that I work in podcasting, it's all about storytelling for brands, which is not something I think I would have even been comfortable saying 2 years ago when I worked in the news, but like, that's how the world works. It's sort of like these entities, just like we all have stories to tell. You've got groups doing great work that have stories to tell. So if you're not getting picked up by the media, definitely just tell your own story, even if it's in short little tidbits on social media. People want to be involved. And yeah, I don't know. You do great work. So it's great for the community to sort of know what's happening. Here's the picture of the sea lamprey. That particular one. So I was just kind of that story. So the same reporter did this story in 2020, then again in 2022. If you read the headline, it's got great words in it, like blood-sucking snake-like fish arrive in New Brunswick waterways to spawn. So it's got a bit of that sort of, it's happening now. This story was mostly written because I think whoever could write it got to use blood-sucking, snake-like, and they got to use that picture. She wrote the story again, in 2020, again in 2022, used exactly the same picture. 'Tis the season for alien-like fish to spawn and die in New Brunswick freshwater. Like, I'm sure the stories are nearly exactly the same, but if there's nothing super exciting happening, nothing newsy happening that day, you still have to put out content. So, and I guess it's just, why not have it be your group who's talking about this, or your group who is getting that sort of like slow news day treatment? Like, and if you follow a lot of this stuff, I think you can get that. The next slide is a picture of Remy Donnell, who worked at the Shediac Bay Watershed Association. I think I was just perusing their website. I came across that they were looking for the freshwater mussel. I called him. He answered the phone. He's like, yeah, come out. I'll show you what we do. He wasn't even out doing this that day, but he just sort of, he played along. And then I think throughout the course of a number of years, I probably did a different version of this story 3 or 4 times. I don't believe he even ever found a freshwater mussel, one of the ones he was looking for, but it was always, it was good to talk about the group. It was good to be able to go out there and sort of talk about what they were up to. And we would just do a check-in on this freshwater mussel, which I don't think was ever found in that area, but I do remember reading a story where freshwater mussels were found. I was almost jealous. It was like, oh, I've been covering that story for years, and it wasn't my group, but anyway, it's good to know they're still out there. And then the next slide. So this is another one where it's just unusual to us. And this might be everyday stuff to some of you, to go out and electrocute fish, to count them. But when I heard about that, I was like, oh, that's a very strange thing. So I went out and did a story in 2015. I wrote a really boring headline: environmental groups shock salmon to study them humanely. It's not a great headline. 7 years later, when exactly the same story was done again, they did a better job. I didn't write this one, but environmental group uses shocking method to catch fish. like this might be something that happens all the time, but it's just a matter of like, it's, you got your Ghostbuster pack, you're using electricity and water. Everything about it is fairly interesting. Why it's happening is almost secondary, but it was all talked about in the story. So it's sort of like using a weird hook of just the unusual to talk about the important work that's being done. My next slide is, why does it all seem so difficult? And sometimes it is, because it's just a matter of like, there's this huge, for the CBC, for any organization, they've got all these sort of pieces flying in the background with timing and, who called in sick that day and what's the news of the day and what do we need? So you can't, even people who work there can't always know what's going on within the organization. It's, there's just so many moving pieces. So it is really hard to kind of strike at exactly the right time so you're going to get the coverage that you want. But I guess it's just always best to be prepared, and to be pitching the stories that you do want to tell is the best way to sort of approach it. All right, so this is just a little bit kind of so formats. There's the newspapers, which are newspapers that come out once a day, once a week, depending. But as far as the CBC, there's there's the different platforms. There's a web story, there's radio, and then there's video, which falls into television and social media. So web story, you find those on the website. The radios, for the different radio shows, there are the morning shows, and there's one afternoon show. And then there's also, so those can be pre-recorded, or you're doing it live on the phone. I don't know how many people actually go into the office anymore to do these. Or you can be part of a news clip or a voicer, which is just a longer piece of news. So you've got the shows, then you've got the newscasts that come out in New Brunswick at particular times in the morning and in the afternoon. Video, you've got the TV show, which in my early days, the TV show was king. You were always the thing you were most concerned with was filing for the New Brunswick CBC TV show. That has since changed, and it's kind of at the bottom of the pile now. Now you have to write a web story, see if you've got time for some radio. You do a video that goes out on social media, and maybe it goes on the TV show if you've got time to kind of do something for it. I don't know, that was such a quick glance, but that's those are the different marks that reporters and producers are trying to meet at the CBC. At newspapers and radio stations that just exclusively do those things, it's different because they've got that one thing to focus on. But at the CBC, there's all these different shows with producers on each show, and some people are news. And, there's just a lot of different pieces to be covered. In a perfect world, you do one interview and it would be used to do all these things, but it's not always how it works. Sometimes you do a 20-minute interview and they use the press release to write the story up, unfortunately. Here's some contact information for some people. You've got the Moncton show, the Fredericton show, St. John, the hosts, those email addresses, which are very important. Send your press releases there. Absolutely. There's the afternoon show, Vanessa Vandervaal. Send your press releases to her. She's got a good bit of time to fill every day. So she's definitely interested in talking to people who can sort of tell a bit of an exciting story around what it is they're doing. Harry Forstell's the host of the TV show. I couldn't find an email specifically for TV, so depending on who's hosting, but still send it to Harry. And then you've got CBCNB, just the news, a general news email. None of these phone numbers will get you a person, but feel free to leave a message. I would definitely go email over phone number for these particular numbers because no one answers them. They listen to them though. This is where if you wanted to talk about this annual barbecue you are having, call it in. Hi, this is my name. I'm with this group. We're having an annual barbecue. This is the information. We'd love everybody to come. And they'll play that on the show. But that's what the phone numbers are for there. And yeah, just sort of a tip sheet. So, who's at the center of the story? Who's your character? What are they doing? Why are they doing it? Like, who's your audience? Who's this really for? Yeah, you can think about what do you want them to think or feel? Like, is this a hilarious story? Is it a tear jerker? It can kind of help you to sort of focus it down as to how you want to tell it, is when you think like the emotion that you're expecting someone to feel. And then what media helps you best tell your story and why. So yeah, like maybe you really see something as great video or television piece And then a person comes out and grabs all that, and then it can kind of be parsed out to all the different bits after that: web story, radio, all that sort of stuff. So thank you very much. Does anybody have any stories they'd like to talk about, how to kind of frame it? Does anyone have any questions for me? Yeah, there's 10 minutes left if you do.
Feel free to type in the chat or raise your hand and unmute. Like Tori said, we have about 10 minutes before we need to wrap up.
You want to talk about podcasting? Yeah.
Sentez-vous libre de mettre vos questions dans le chat. En français aussi, si vous voulez, je peux faire la traduction. Ça me fait plaisir de le faire. Vous pouvez aussi unmuter puis dire votre question à voix haute.
I just got, I do Duolingo. I did a 500-day streak in French, but I wish, I do genuinely apologize for not speaking French. I wish that my French were better. I'm working on it, but it's not there yet.
Eleni.
Yeah, thanks. This has all been super interesting. Could I get you to go back to your last slide? I was making notes and didn't quite get it all before you nuked the slide. But my question is about getting the camera too, getting people involved in the story in front of media as well. How that's a little bit challenging on the nonprofit side because we're so, we don't want to put people out there. We don't want to make people uncomfortable. And I'm a health and environmental NGO, so I'm often talking to patients. What sorts of things and tips can you give us from how do we pitch to the humans to be part of our media story in a way that's not exploiting their story?
Yes. And I know that is a tough one because I did find I understood when groups would be like, I've got somebody, let me talk to them. It's like, great. But then after asking so many people to do interviews, the approach is half the battle. Like how you approach it does make a big difference, because I do understand, especially these are people who you want to be protective of. You don't want, you don't want to put them out there if they don't want to. But I mean, I would, and even as a reporter, that was never what I wanted. But generally just approach of okay, this is what, this is the story. We're going to be we're hoping to talk to the media. And this is a story about the fish ladder in your backyard. Would you be interested in talking to them? It could be a radio, it could be a television camera. And that's where if you've got a relationship, you can be like, I know this reporter, they're really quite nice, and it's not going to be terribly difficult if you're comfortable. I do find if you approach people who are like, yeah, the media is going to be here, but you don't have to do it. Then they're like, yeah, why would I want, I don't want to do that. But if it's like, this is exactly what I'm expecting, we'd love to have you part of the story. This is what I'd expect you to talk. This is what I think you'd be asked about. It's up to you. And then they can at least, yeah. And if they don't want to, absolutely. You don't want to be putting people on the spot. And I understand with health, it's particularly difficult. Yeah. Oh, I can't.
Sorry, I muted myself again. I just said yes, super hard.
Yeah. But yeah, I do find the approach, because it's a tough one, because you don't want people doing things they don't want, but it's almost like karaoke. Sometimes you can tell somebody wants to do it, but they're like, oh, I can't. And you're like, well, you don't have to, but if you want to, you can. And they're like, oh, but you don't want to be pressuring somebody who genuinely does not want to do it. But sometimes it's I found in my early days, it would just be sometimes, let's say I'd ask a group of people and all the women would be like, no, I don't want to. And it's but I really want a woman. I'm happy to talk to guys and I want women too, but can you, but you didn't want to pressure them. But at the same time, it's I'd like to sort of hear from different people for the story. It is tough. Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions or questions? Il nous reste 5 minutes. We have about 5 minutes.
Oh, and Melanie, I think the slides will be available after the fact.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Is that true? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I will share the slides with all registrants.
Well, Annika, you said, so the most social media attention you've ever gotten was for the story that Lily was talking about earlier. Did you find it to be big news, or was it just happened to be that one outlet covered it, so they all did?
Yeah, well, we've had some social media attention, some media attention for other
Mhm.
stories, notably around our awards. During our 30th anniversary, we had a bit of media attention there.
Mhm.
But this is probably the most that we've ever gotten on one particular story where we had multiple coverage across uh, different platforms, let's say.
And
And I
it is
think,
often because it's just easy, right? It's like, oh, we know exactly who we can talk to because we just watched that story and we'll just do the same version.
yeah, essentially. And I think it helped that this was around the results of a public survey of opinion that specifically was talking about how New Brunswickers aren't feeling themselves prepared, but feel that their governments are even less prepared than them to deal with climate change. So,
Yeah, very timely.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I've found that I've had some opportunities where there's been, say, I spoke to Information Morning in St. John. Well, then the other Information Mornings call me up and say, well, we want to do that story too. Will you do it with us tomorrow? And
Yeah.
that's great. I love that. Is there a flip side to that where if I do get an interview with one of them, I can pop it off to the others and say, hey, don't miss out. I'm going to be talking about this with your colleagues. We can do it the same day. I did one day where I did one interview, one city, one morning, and then the other two major cities the next morning. And they knew that each other was calling me and made their time slots work with each other.
Yeah. They're good at that. So yeah, there's nothing, if you get interest from one place, feel free to, especially now that you have emails or some kind of contact from the
Mm.
shows, you can just be like, oh, hey, just so you know, I'm talking to Julia right about this. So if you want to book me off for the same day, yeah, saves you time. And then you're kind of in the zone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, in a perfect world, they'd be telling each other that on a daily basis, but having worked there, it doesn't always happen. It's shocking sometimes how disconnected all the different shows can be, despite lots of planning and conversations. It's just, people get busy and you focus hard. You just focus so hard on what you're trying to do. You forget to tell the other person that you got the interview that everybody's been working for the last 3 hours. You just get it and run with it. And then you're like, oh, I was supposed to let the morning show know. So it happens.
And I've also found that the French radio station is, I've done quite a few interviews for them. It seems like maybe their pool of interviewees is a little smaller.
Could be true.
And then I've had some spin-offs off of that. Yeah, Lily is saying that they've noticed that as well. So, it might behoove you to go hard after the French station if you're French speaking, and then once you secure that one, then you can pitch it to the others.
Exactly. If they know that you can show up and do a good job and you'll answer your phone, it just goes with that. It's like everybody's so busy in every industry that whatever makes it easier to still do a good job, they're into it. Yeah. That's why the more you can spell it out for them, you develop these relationships. Yeah. It's just I mean, people try not to have the same people on the show over and over and over again, but it happens because you've got such tight deadlines. You make a phone call, you answer the phone, you're going to be on the radio. That's just how it works.
Well, we're 1 minute before 2 p.m., so I think we should probably wrap it here. And I want to say a big thank you to Tori for this excellent presentation and being here with us today. And I also want to say thank you to all of you who attended. I will be sharing the slides, and the recording of this session will be available on our YouTube channel later in the week. So thank you again, everyone.
Thanks so much.